Welcome. My name is Ceci Sparrow. I am the social media manager here at the Frontline. I am a light-skinned Black woman. My hair is up. I have sister locks. My hair is up in some sort of a ponytail with bangs. I have on rather large glasses, tortoiseshell glasses, gold earrings, a necklace, and today I'm wearing a olive-colored jumpsuit. And I'm here to welcome you to a conversation about autism acceptance and racial justice. But first, let me introduce the Frontline. What is the Frontline? The Frontline is a Black woman-led campaign with the Working Families Party, in conjunction with the Working Families Party, the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project, United We Dream, and the Rising Majority. I'm going to have our guests introduce themselves one by one. First up is Morénike. Hi, Morénike. Tell us about yourself. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, that's better. Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here with you all. I'm Morénike Giwa Onaiwu, and I am a professor, an educator, a parent, advocate, author, and autistic adult. I was diagnosed with autism in adulthood after my two youngest children. I also have a number of other diagnoses, and so I'm just really happy to be here with our great panelists so that we can talk about autism during Autism Acceptance Month and about how it impacts the Black community.
Okay. Reyma, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Reyma McCoy Hyten. My pronouns are she and her. And my visual description is as follows. I am a Black woman with admittedly very beige skin. I have long, large, natural brown hair. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses and a Black to the Future t-shirt. And I'm seated in my home office with various pieces of artwork behind me. And I'm absolutely delighted to join everybody in what I think is an incredibly pivotal conversation today.
Thank you. Dr. Hardwick, tell us about yourself.
Well, hello, my name is Lamar Hardwick. I am a father, husband, pastor, author, and also autistic adult, diagnosed late in life at age 36. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a, dare I say, middle-aged Black male, dark skin, gray glasses, with ever graying hair and graying beard. And I'm wearing a Black t-shirt with the letters MRCY, which is Hebrew for mercy.
Thank you so much.
And I just realized I did not give any physical descriptions nor pronouns. So thank you, everyone. Just, executive functioning fail. But I am a dark-skinned, non-binary Black woman sitting on the floor in my living room. So there are books behind me and some other random things. I have, I'm wearing a long micro-braided wig, a scarf, and a white polo short-sleeve shirt. I have a slinky in my hands, and the walls behind me are an off-white color. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to keep the focus on you, Morénike, and have you lead our discussion today.
Absolutely. So again, I just really want to thank both of you for being here, Lamar and Reyma, and everyone who's watching as well. As we near the end of Autism Acceptance Month, I think it's just really important to talk about our community and ourselves as well. And so I would love if you all could share and what led you to autism advocacy and disability justice in the first place. What is it that made you feel that there was a need for your voice, your perspective among the other individuals who are in the community advocating? And so I have in my order that I have Reyma first for this question, but if either of you would like to go first, you don't have to necessarily use that order.
This is Reyma, and I'll happily go first. I am a person whose entire professional career has been comprised of work in the disability community, providing services and supports to people with disabilities. In the beginning as a direct service professional, and then as I moved along in my career as a coordinator of services, program manager, and then finally executive director. So I have 20 plus years experience in a professional capacity as far as disability services and supports are concerned. Now, why did I get into disability services and supports? Well, in 1986, when I was 6 years old, prior to becoming a ward of the state, I was diagnosed with autism. And it was actually one of the reasons why I entered into the foster care system, because my family did not know what to do with me. I also am the child of an autistic person. My father, a Black man, is autistic as well. And so I observed him participate in services and supports. I personally participated in services and supports. I found them to leave much to be desired, so to speak. They were marginal at best and terrible at the worst. And so I felt that I could, given my own personal experience, become a service provider as well, informed by what I felt were imperatives as far as the provision of services and supports, particularly to those of us that are racially marginalized, brown and Black folks in particular. And so in the providing of services and supports, I reached a point where it became very clear to me that Black and brown disabled folks' disability experience is very different from the experience of white disabled people, to the point of where our disability experience, particularly for those of us that are non-apparently disabled, and by non-apparent, I mean, you can't look at any of us and say, and peg a disability, but we all experience a disability, certainly. For those of us who are non-apparently disabled and Black at the same time, our experiences can be pathologized to the point where our interactions with law enforcement officers and other officials at the municipal, state, and federal level are directly correlated to the fact that we're Black and disabled, autistic in our instances. I wanted to do something about that. And so that's how I got into advocacy about 10 years ago. And with getting into advocacy, I became introduced to what's known as the independent living movement, which is a movement, for those of you that don't know, that is led by disabled people, advocating for the advancement of disabled people. And as I think we probably are all well aware, is steeped in white supremacy. And so my advocacy for the disability community became very focused on advocating for racially marginalized disabled folks within disabled spaces. And that's where I am today.
Thank you. There's such a need for that. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think that the aspect of, like when we think about the disability justice model, and we think about the fact that intersectionality and leadership of the most impacted and the different principles of that, how it differs significantly from that of disability rights. And it is definitely a really, our experience is not the same as that of our colleagues who, have, a different appearance. And so, Lamar, I'd love to hear from you as well. You've been, like Reyma, you've worn a lot of hats, in your life. And just, could you share what are the things that kind of led you to autism advocacy and disability justice in your work?
Sure. And thank you, Reyma, for that. For sharing that was great. As I mentioned, was late diagnosed. So I was 36. That was back in 2014. Um, I can specifically pinpoint what prompted me to become more involved, particularly as I was sort of trying to make my way through, um, trying to figure out what this all meant. Although at around the age of 7 or 8, I knew there were significant differences between me and my peers. Just didn't have the language to sort of describe and help people to understand me. And so um, I specifically remember very early on in post diagnosis was trying to find voices that I could listen to, read, conferences, those types of things. And the thing that struck me was that a lot of at the time, what I thought were the mainstream conferences, the ones that were meaningful, at least the ones that were presented as being the most meaningful, had no people of color at all. And so it was like entering back into this world of understanding, oh, it's here too, right? Like it's not just being a Black man, but even within the disability community, and even more particularly, even within the autism community, there was no. Now this is 2014. I don't want to make it seem like there weren't great people, Black people who are doing great work, but they are not visible. They weren't platformed. Their ideas and their perspectives were not valued, and so I almost felt invisible again, and so that prompted me to get more involved, particularly. And I mentioned this. I'm a pastor and have been one for a long time. And this was certainly not something that was talked about at all in the faith community, particularly the faith communities that are predominantly Black. And there's lots of reasons for that. I'm not trying to totally lay the blame on the Black faith community, but I did realize that there is a huge gap there. And so I just started trying to share my experience and my story, because there were just huge gaps between what I was being told and what I was able to find. And so you just kind of felt like that, Du Bois talks about that double consciousness, right? It's like triple, quadruple consciousness. And I became even more glaringly aware, not that I was not aware of race and white supremacy, but even more so the deeper I got into the disability community and the autism community, it was even more of a reminder. And so I continue to do that work, especially in the space that I work in, mainly because I also understand the profound influence in which religion has had on these issues. And although I'm a pastor, I still have a very critical lens of how I feel like Western Christianity, particularly white evangelicalism, has had a profound influence on the issues that we're talking about. And I wanted to try to make an impact in that way as well.
It's just fascinating. I'm just thinking that this conversation is just so heavy because, I think about, people ask me sometimes, well, what got you into advocacy, and I'm like, anger. I was angry. I was angry at the way I was being treated. I was angry at the way that, my children were being treated. I was angry at the status quo. It wasn't acceptable to me. And there was nothing really else to do but to fight, but to try to speak up and not to accept things the way that they are. And I think that, there's so many different nuances when you look at the intersection of disability and race. And then if you add in other aspects to, other marginalizations, just so many different things. It's something that really is not talked about except at surface level, and then no one really wants to make any changes. And it's very, as you both mentioned, the systemic racism is so deeply interwoven into the society, but into these communities, in particular, disability and autism communities. And it's, and especially when you're looking at the aspect of healthcare, and that's been really, really heightened and pronounced during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in general, there's just so much racism kind of really impacts the Black, autism experience and community in so many different ways. And I just didn't know if you all wanted to talk a little bit about those. I know that Reyma, you mentioned that it was part of the reason why you were, placed into the system, and we know that there's that, either if it's congregate care or the school to prison pipeline. We know that happens a lot with our youth. We know we see that with, our adults as well, in terms of the, correctional facilities. And so we know there's a lot of that aspect. And then there's the late diagnosed piece that you mentioned, Lamar, that is also something that happens because we don't look autistic, according to people. So whether it's gender disparities or access to the type of services that, leave much to be desired, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on, I know it's a kind of a deep rabbit hole to get into, but in the racism piece, how, kind of like what is its role and how does it kind of fuel these inequities?
This is Reyma. So I'll begin by uplifting something that you just said. We don't look autistic, right? What does an autistic person look like? Autism is a non-apparent disability. You can't look at somebody and say, oh, wow, they've got autism. You can tell by looking at the way that they stand, or a missing appendage or anything like that. And yet there is a look for autism. There's a default setting for who looks autistic, and that default setting is white. White people are the default setting of the autism community and the autistic community. Let me go back real quick. So autism community is the community that where parents, guardians, professionals, non-disabled, non-autistic advocates are kind of front and center advocating, quote unquote, on behalf of autistic loved ones. The autistic community is driven and led by people who are actually autistic. Both communities steeped in white supremacy. Both communities driving the narrative that to be autistic is to be white. And so for those of us who are not white and are autistic, where does that leave us? The fact of the matter is that when you do not look like the default setting, therein begins the experience of being marginalized. And so with regards to white being the default setting for autism, this shows up all over the place. Research, any kind of empirical data pertaining to the autistic experience primarily centers the experiences of white autistic people, and until recently, white autistic males. And so for those of us that are not white but are autistic, we look at data that supposedly pertains to the experience of autism, and we don't see ourselves, right? And the paraprofessionals, the special education teachers, et cetera, who provide services and supports and interventions to autistic people have been trained to work with white autistic clients, consumers, students, whatever. We show up in all of our Black glory and our autism, and they don't know what to do with that. And this is why when I was providing direct services and supports to disabled people, I would show up to IEP meetings for white autistic students, and the student would be front and center, sitting at the table, surrounded by their support network. And then when I show up to IEP meetings and the student in question was Black, sometimes I would show up and that child would be in a padded room. We don't understand the Black autistic experience, those of us who provide services and supports, because we haven't been trained to understand it. We haven't been trained to prioritize it. What we have been trained to do is, if we encounter an autistic person that is not white, we are trained socialized, conditioned to expect them to act the way that the data shows autistic people act. And if they don't act that way, we pathologize them. We put them in a padded room. We propel them on the preschool to prison pipeline. And this is why a disproportionate number of Black and brown disabled students, autistic or any other disability, more often than not interface with law enforcement officers in the judicial system than our white disabled and autistic counterparts do. It's a huge issue hidden in plain sight. We need to be talking about it more, particularly those of us who articulate concern with regards to judicial reform issues and the issues that impact the brown and Black community with regards to how we interface with carceral settings and that kind of thing. Disability is baked into the paradigm, that particular paradigm. The fact that we as a society do not appreciate, understand, or even prioritize the unique experiences of racially marginalized disabled people, including autistic folks, is a penultimate reason why the incarcerated rates for Black and brown disabled people are through the roof in this country. It's a penultimate reason why the rate of police violence exacted towards Black and brown people who are disabled are, astronomical in comparison to the rates with regards to non-disabled people, and particularly non-disabled white people. And so for those of you who are listening to this program and feel like you're unfamiliar with the issues pertaining to disability justice, if you have interest and concern with regards to just criminal justice issues, then this is something that you need to be paying more attention to.
Absolutely. I think about there is a Camille Proctor is a neurodivergent Black parent who runs the Color of Autism and talks about how sometimes when talking to Black parents, people are like, well, I'm concerned. I don't want my son or my daughter or my child to be labeled. And what she tells them is, oh, they're going to be labeled. If they're not labeled as autistic, they're going to be labeled as inmate number XYZ this, or problematic, or non-compliant, or what have you. And, we know that the statistics show that, 1 in 4 Black boys, typically is going to, they're more likely to have out of school suspension from primary school on up than their peers. We know about the educational attainment being lower. We know about the fact that we earn less. We know that we are diagnosed later. We know that we're misdiagnosed. The numbers go on and on and on. And it's frightening, kind of what you were talking about, like with the youth, because if you think about the fact that a lot of times in the Black community, there's all types of things that are already there. They're just not given a name or described in a particular way. And the invisibilization of the Black experience is very, very real when it comes to autism, as you mentioned. And that's why not only are we not recognized by the white autistics, that's why we don't recognize ourselves in our own communities, but it's there, and you think about, like, there's certain statistics that say that when you look at some of the youth that are in, like some of the statistics say that approximately of the youth that are in most, juvenile justice system, so that over 3/4 of those are neurodivergent, of whom many are autistic or undiagnosed autistic, and less than 27% of those were ever receiving any services at all. And we aren't going to say that the services they're getting when they were locked up are subpar, but at least they were getting something. And so it's frightening. It really, really is frightening. And so, Lamar, you're a Black man, you know what I mean? So in this country, and so it's, so there's, I would just, really love the same question if you could kind of share your thoughts about the systemic racism. You mentioned The fact that there were so few, being able to see so few people of color and, and Black people specifically. And I think that we can relate to that experience as well, that there's like pockets of us a little here and there, but we aren't really seen and we aren't really heard. And both the autism and the autistic community do very much center the white experience. And that, not only center, but that is the experience. And so I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, Reyma covered so much good stuff. I I almost don't want to come behind her and say anything, but I think one of the things that is hugely frustrating is like even the statistics that you just gave, like they're right in front of us. Even down to recently, I wrote a few articles about the most recent data that came out that said that Black and Latino children who do not have a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability are still not diagnosed at the same rates when it comes to autism. And one of the things I pointed out is when there's a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability, I think the numbers were 32% and 39% for those who identify male and female, which means a large majority of autistics do not also have a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability. So if you think about if autism is supposedly being diagnosed by the observation of a certain set of behaviors, if you remove intellectual disability, which it's also said that intellectual disability is not supposed to further explain autism. So my question was, then why are the rates still, why is there still a gap? And what I have been challenging people with, especially as it comes to being a Black male, is that's because when those same behaviors are displayed in young Black and brown bodies, they're interpreted as something completely different. And similar to what Reyma said, what we end up seeing is that's just not the case with autism or disability, right? Because whiteness has been the center of what it means to be healthy, then all behavior has been determined by that standard. And so the further out you get from that, there's a much different way of interpreting that behavior, which is why you said it leads to the suspensions. But ultimately it leads to, like, I live in Georgia, so we think about the Ahmaud Arbery case where he was basically murdered because they decided to interpret his behavior as being suspicious. And so if you zoom out, and me being a Black man and being autistic, understanding that and so I don't want to say white people, but whiteness itself, the concept in which was used to create the social order of this nation, has always been at the privilege and in the driver's seat of being able to determine what set of behaviors are okay and what set of behaviors are not. And so even in the case where we're supposed to be able to have objective observation about the same set of behaviors that white children have that should diagnose persons like myself much sooner, whiteness doesn't allow for the interpretation of those behaviors to be anything other than something that is deemed to be dangerous. And so even if you zoom out, it's this way of whiteness having the privilege of being able to determine what behaviors are dangerous. And you see that even though Ahmaud Arbery was not autistic, as far as I know, or disabled, the same concept applies, right? The whiteness gets to determine that his behavior was dangerous, and it also gets to determine that his behavior should be, because it's considered dangerous, to be sentenced to death. And so that's the scary part. But also you see it in healthcare, right? It is. I was reading a book recently by Sabrina Strings called "The Fear of the Black Body," and she's talking about how fat phobia is actually anti-Blackness. But what I love, there's a chapter where she talks about how the modern healthcare system was basically set up as a way of trying to get the white woman to be able to outlive Black people when, in fact, enslaved Africans were set free. And so the whole concept of what it even means to be healthy comes from a place of a very racist history. And that's applied to typical people, but it's doubly applied to those of us who find ourselves in the autistic or the disability community, because we're even further away from that core set of behaviors. And then the last thing I'll say is this: even within the autistic community, what I found is that that's also applied in that there also are attempts even within that community to determine the set of behaviors that Black autistics display as to whether or not we should be validated even within that community, which is a whole other conversation that we could have. And so you're even asked to perform up to a standard of whiteness within the autistic community in order to be validated. And so I just say that to say that we're so inside of a system that I don't know that people who are not people of color understand the ramifications of all of what Reyma shared and what I shared, and that's the frustrating part, because the numbers show it. The data is apparent. It's not like we're lacking evidence. It's just that's how whiteness operates.
You're right. And it delay in between diagnosis from the 3-year. That's sad that's something to consider celebrating. And then even the accessing of services. We know that even after diagnosis, white children are 2/3 more likely to be accessing multiple services. We know that they tend to be on wait lists in a shorter amount of time. They're 10% or more likely to be in the general education, setting, 80% or more of the day, unlike our children. There's just so many things that, it's scary. And then the things that we've been talking about with regard to the criminal justice system and being profiled. And so, I think about the fact that it's that so many of the, of the hashtags that we know, of people who've been, unarmed individuals who've been murdered by the police, so many of them were disabled, but the disability identity is one that's kind of really downplayed. And so people don't look at the fact that it was being, both the racial piece and the disabled piece are what put them in risk. And the fact that Reginald Neeli Latson's name is not a household, name, is frightening because, again, being Black, autistic, and trying to go to the library or trying to jog or trying to do any number of things. There's so many situations that, can be named, in school districts, in healthcare settings and so forth, where we are, children and our adults have been restrained and harmed and injured, and it's ignored, largely. And it's humbling, because I think another thing that you mentioned is that there's an expectation of what the performance is or how you should be, even amongst the people who are supposed to be your own. So, we could talk about, the aspect and, some issues within the Black community in terms of lack of understanding or lack of disability understanding, but we can go take it outside of that to the disability and or to autism and autistic communities and their priorities, and versus that of ours, and what is supposed to be of importance in research, in policy, in practice, and how it constantly downgrades and erases what we need, and how autism is supposed to look. And so it's just all of these things really, really converge. And then you still have to live life, right, with all of the other aspects of who you are. And so, it kind of just really raises the question in terms of, this is Autism Acceptance Month, formerly Autism Awareness Month, or still that to the greater public. But, I think it's just really important to talk about, in the midst of all of these things that we've shared, in the context of all of these things, and yet having an awareness of who we are, autism acceptance, how does it look? How does it feel? What is it for us? It's different. You know what I mean? How can we, there's a narrative of what autism acceptance means, but if we're taking the white narrative out and we're talking for our own selves, for you, what is autism acceptance, and what are some ways that we can amplify the voices of, our Black autistic siblings? Because they're going to come in, and I think like most of us, come in bright and shiny and realize very quickly that, that things are not what they seem, and that the white supremacy that exists everywhere else is front and center in this community that they, thought embraced them as well. So how can we make sure that their voices are heard? We're starting to see more, Black TikTokers who are autistic, and our youth and adults are really starting to have a voice. And how can we help amplify them? And also talk about acceptance, and how can we counter some of these things?
This is Reyma. I'll go first. That is the question. I'm delighted to see how Gen Z, people who are young enough to be my kid, who are on the spectrum and Black and just proud as can be, are doing their thing on TikTok. I'm like, go ahead, babies, do your thing. And I'm thrilled to see that, because certainly that wasn't my experience, and I think we're all super young Gen Xers or super old millennials here, and so we had to kind of experience a few valleys, so to speak, so that the emerging leaders don't have to do what we did, so to speak. And Lord knows the folks that came before us had to encounter things that we can't even begin to imagine. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. I'm in awe at where we've come. And I'm in awe with regards to where it looks like the emerging leaders, the future generations, are going. Now, with regards to how do we amplify emerging leaders? How do we make sure that the Black community shifts from autism awareness to autism acceptance to autism celebration or whatever? And I'm going to kind of take us into a rabbit hole, if that's okay. Morénike, you and I think, have been in hot water with the autistic community a whole bunch because of our approach with regards to how we use ourselves as bridges between the autistic community and the Black community. I think that my very intentional departure from the autistic community a few years ago, in response to how the autistic community came after some of our non-autistic Black sisters in the disabled community, who participated in an event with Holly Robinson Peete, is quite indicative of that. And I know that you've had similar experiences to that. The fact of the matter is that one thing that the autistic community is not comfortable with talking about is the fact that, frankly, because Black folks have been shut out of its spaces, that's left us with no choice, including our parents, guardians, non-disabled advocates, with no choice but to reach out to the autism community for resources, for information, for support, whatever. Now, that's not ideal, but that is what it is. And so what brings us back to the conversations that we've been having with regards to how whiteness has unfortunately created impediments to the inclusion of us in autistic spaces. And so, that also brings forward an imperative to have conversations with regards to, well, how did autistic spaces become steeped in whiteness and in white supremacy? The autistic community is an offshoot of the disability rights movement. And frankly, I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little bit provocative, but the fact of the matter is is that if you look at the timing as far as the disability rights movement, which kind of gathered steam after the Black Civil Rights Movement set a formidable foundation in the mid-60s. The fact of the matter is that white disabled people and white loved ones of disabled people saw the successes of the Black Civil Rights Movement, saw that, you know, their maids, their drivers, their garbage collectors who are Black were starting to get rights. And they said, you know, that makes us uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable that Black people are getting civil rights. And, you know, I, as a white man in a wheelchair, am not able to get on the bus. There's a slogan from the beginnings of the disability rights movement that goes as follows. You know, the Blacks were mad because they had to sit on the back of the bus. Well, we with disabilities are mad because we can't get on the bus at all. You know, setting up this false equivalency. Well, if the Blacks can have something, then why can't we? And that energy is ultimately what spearheaded the creation of the autistic community. And so if that's the case, then the fact of the matter is that we've got a community that, you know, at best does not understand the Black autistic experience, and at worst understands that if Black people can have something, then we should have something too. And that's not a community building attitude by any stretch of the imagination. And so, you know, we all have had our experiences with the autistic community. What I observe, thanks to the blessing and the curse that is social media, those that are following us, those that are young enough to be our children, are not necessarily engaging with any kind of communities, and are taking their advocacy fully in the 21st century to social media, and, you know, are kind of creating their own virtual communities. And I think that that's absolutely wonderful. And I think it behooves us all who are observing this to support it by, you know, amplifying what's being put out by young Gen Zers, by young autistic Gen Zers, you know, and doing what we can, you know, if it's you know, making financial contributions, you know, using our networks to support emerging leaders to get connected to whoever they need to get connected to so that they can move forward as well. You know, whatever it takes, we need to do it. One of the things that is really unfortunate about the disabled community, so speaking beyond the autistic community, to the community that's led by disabled people, that's very cross disability in nature, is that unfortunately, historically, and the history of the disabled community is relatively short, just a few generations of people. But as the new generation has come forward, the previous generations, you know, have been reticent to pass the mic, so to speak. We can't do that. We can't do that. You know, it's going to be generations that follow us that you know, evolve this thing from rights to justice and ultimately to where it needs to be, which is liberation. And so, you know, we got to pass the mic at you know, at every available opportunity, ultimately.
Yes. I know Lamar is a preacher, but you're preaching up in here because this is so true. This is so true. It's just such an important, you know, important dialogue. We, you know, there's so much, you know, beauty and energy, you know, in our young up and coming Black autistics who haven't had to walk the path that we have had. And, we do stand on the shoulders of giants. I think about how, people will mention Jim Sinclair and a number of other individuals who are, instrumental in the autistic community, but Anita Cameron is seldom mentioned and so forth. And so, so Lamar, the same thing, like, when you think about autism acceptance and what it means and amplifying the voices of our Black autistic siblings, what are some things that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Again, everything that was shared was great. I would add on to that, as we are talking about the civil rights movement. One of the hallmarks was this idea that, and I love that you use the word liberation, that liberation was closely akin to this idea of freedom of movement. And so I'm not talking about mobility or being ambulatory, but just freedom of movement, being able to navigate this nation and its systems freely without threat of being held back at the least, and murdered at the extreme end of that. And so when I think of that, and me coming from the tradition of the predominantly Black church, which largely led the civil rights movement, right? Liberation is always like the end goal. And if that means freedom of movement, one of the things that I am appreciating again about this next generation is that social media and technology has sort of opened that up, right? Because our generation, for better or worse, was largely schooled in the idea of attaching ourselves to institutions. What has been problematic about that is a lot of those institutions generally occupy predominantly white spaces. And so, so I always use this phrase that, if you're going to blaze a trail, you can't be afraid of fire. Right. And so those of us on this call and so many others that you've mentioned, we've had to go in and sort of set fire to some of those institutions that, and also I'll speak on my experience, that seemed to open its arms to us. But what I found personally, and some of the reason why I very quickly vacated a lot of the things that I was engaged in the autistic community, is because it seemed to open its doors. But it was only if I would placate and play by the rules and perform up to the standards of whiteness that gave me a sense of worthiness to carry the banner of autistic, right? And so why I quickly switched to is figuring out, I've come from a long tradition of the Black church being about liberation, about being justice oriented. And so I switched to trying to set fire to some of those things, right? And so I say that to say this, that has come and does come at a cost to many of us. And it's a cost that we're undoubtedly willing to pay. But we also have to recognize that in passing the torch, knowing that the next generation that's coming along has some of the energy that we no longer have, because we've been spending the last 10 years setting fire to stuff, right? And because they're not as schooled in the ideology of being attached to institutions, and because they have a plethora of tools in their arsenal, in their tool belt, like social media, TikTok, and all that, they don't even see a need at all to attach themselves to institutions, let alone attach themselves to institutions that are predominantly white spaces that end up sapping their energy and strength the way that it did some of us. And so I, for the strength and energy that I continue to have, I continue to try to burn down some things. but also know that there are those coming alongside of that know how to use things that I'm not a great TikToker. I don't, right? But they have the energy, and they're not starting off their journey attached to institutions that end up siphoning off some of their precious energy. One of the books I love is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, when he's telling his son about, I'm paraphrasing, but at some point, we who are Black should be very careful to giving our bodies over to the types of things that our forefathers had to do, right? Because at some point, it ends up costing us. And so there was a time where that was needed, and some of us are standing on the heels, like our parents and our forefathers. We're attached to that movement, so we understand that. But my hope and prayer is that the generation coming behind us won't have to give themselves over and put themselves in spaces and put themselves in situations that's going to siphon off that energy, and put themselves in spaces that's going to do them harm in the long run. So I agree with Reyma, like platforming them. I've been able over the last couple of years to burn down some stuff and get myself into some places where I can make decisions. And I've been trying to bring along people who are less well known, and putting them on some stages and some platforms. But then the last thing I'll say is I'd also like to see us, part of the civil rights movement, and me being a pastor, also knowing that, and I always tell people, the Black church was not Black people's invention. White people invented the Black church because they didn't want us in their churches. But I also see some value in that, right? And so I would love to see a stronger connection with a lot of our strong Black institutions, our sororities and fraternities, our barbershops, our, the cornerstones of the Black community that have held us down for centuries. And I don't have an answer for what that looks like, but I know that those institutions have stood the test of time, and their origin is also removing themselves from predominantly white spaces for the sake of protecting our ability to be Black and to be liberated to move freely in those spaces. And so I would think, I think what a great opportunity that would be to tap into some of the origin stories of our Black institutions, our HBCUs, our sororities and fraternities, our barbershops, our businesses, for those who do religion, some of our faith communities, right? Because they also have a rich origin story of saying we are not going to place ourselves in predominantly white spaces that do us harm. And they have stood the test of time. And I wonder what it would look like to have a greater partnership with them in promoting autism acceptance, because they also have a blueprint for how to stand the test of time and to build something that allows Black people and in my vision, even Black autistics, to find spaces where they can be liberated, where they can move around freely and not have to navigate white spaces that end up taking up their precious energy and resources.
Wow. Yes. Yes. And that's just, there are a few places, I've started to see some of our younger, Black autistic leaders on college campuses and some of these things kind of starting to make these connections. But I agree, and I think all three of us have been involved in having to burn things down. But the good thing about fire is it lights the way, right? And so by bringing, by having a light, again, where our youth don't have to be connected to these institutions and can use their energy more constructively, not fighting against this system, but building. I think that's what we really need, is just, we need to continue moving forward as a community, and we just need to kind of, we need to hold on, but we also need to recognize, I think, that we occupy a different space and our experience is different and it isn't validated, in these other places. And we just have to recognize that we don't need to look to those places or to those people for our validation. We're not going to find our liberation in the white community or the autism community, the autistic community. We're going to be our own liberation. And so, wow, this has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I hope actually we can have a series of these. I'm just really grateful for the Frontline being willing and, to be able to host this discussion and to amplify it. And this isn't something that is just, oh, it's April and it's done. This is an ongoing thing that connects with so many issues in our community at large. So I'm hoping that, we can all be part of a larger dialogue that brings in more people and brings in, more disciplines and so forth to address these things. I don't know if any of you have anything to say in closing before, we, kind of start to wrap up.
This is Reyma, and I'll just kind of continue to beat the dead horse, so to speak. If you are listening to this program and you are passionate about criminal justice reform, if you want to end the criminalization and incarceration of Black and brown folks in this country, this is your wake-up call to get educated about how disability intersects with the Black experience in this country. Again, the default setting for disability in the US is white. And so the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, for those of us who are disabled and not white, we get misunderstood and we get put in jail and prison. And so, I cannot emphasize to folks that are listening to this program the importance of getting educated about disability. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, so to speak. I know that disability can feel very foreign to many people, but this is the elephant in the room, so to speak. When we're talking about criminal justice reform, if we're not talking about how disability fits into things, we're not having a complete conversation.
Yeah, and I would echo that and just kind of speak from the place of my own experience and profession. And that is that we have to continue to be better at what I call the hermeneutics of human behavior, which is interpreting, right? For since the foundation of this nation, the narrative has been that whiteness has been the sole vehicle for interpreting behavior. And so as Black folks, I would just encourage us to continue to share our wealth of knowledge, to share our experience, our expertise. There's so many wonderful people in this community who can help us to, as a form of resistance, retrain our community and retrain hopefully even those in the autism community and then the disability community at large to reframe the ways in which we interpret human behavior, that whiteness is not the goal. Whiteness is not a vehicle to full maturity and success. And it's also not the vehicle for interpreting human behavior, because if that continues to be the base for how we interpret human behavior, that if whiteness continues to be our hermeneutic for human behavior, then Black folks will never be able to live up to a standard, because the goal line continues to move. And so we got to take charge as an act of resistance and say, we are those who speak about what it means to be Black, what it means to behave a certain way, what it means to be autistic and Black or disabled and Black, and use that as a way of just reframing the entire discussion so that we don't find ourselves in the situations that Reyma is talking about. But I also agree that we have to have that conversation about the intersection between disability and race, because it profoundly impacts the criminal justice system.
Thank you. And so I would just say that in closing that we definitely have to have these conversations. And I think part of it is hopefully kind of taking a step back and looking at things. We have to unlearn a lot of, things that have been hidden. So if we look at a lot of the luminaries in the Black community, they were disabled. When we look at Sojourner Truth, when we look at Harriet Tubman, when we look at Fannie Lou Hamer, when we look at so many people, when we look at these, there's a heritage. This is when we look at a lot of the, people who were involved in the civil rights movement and so forth, and the intersection of the civil rights movement and the things that the disability rights, leaders learned from them and so forth. And we're also seeing some of this globally, like if we look at the Black community globally and some of the work that is being done. So I think we can look to our history, and build these connections and then we can also look forward and look ahead in this way as well. And so I thank you both. I just really appreciate what you've shared and just hope that, again, if you care about criminal justice, if you care about education, if you care about healthcare, if you care about reproductive justice, if you care about gender justice, if you're not understanding how disability intersects with things, then you're not going to get very far. It is front and center. And we are there. And disability may look like whiteness, but it's our lives that are being impacted the most. It's our children that are being restrained in the schools, and it's our loved ones that are in the criminal justice system and that are getting do not resuscitate orders and so forth. It's our lives, and so we're the ones we're waiting for, and we have to be that.
Thank you all so very much for this really important conversation. I appreciate all of the knowledge that you've shared. And we at the Frontline are forever grateful for your contributions. Where can we find each of you out here on these internet streets? We'll start with Dr. Hardwick.
Well, I'm on all social media, so particularly on Twitter, you can find me at Autism Pastor. But one of the best and fastest ways is to go to my website, autismpastor.com, and you can find all of my socials, links to my books, and everything else you would need to be able to get in touch with me.
Reyma, how can we find you?
And I am, as far as social media is concerned, primarily on Facebook. So just find me by my name. I also have a website, www.reymasa.org, so reyma.org, and would be happy to interact with anybody that has questions, comments, looking for clarification. These are conversations that I live for, so.
And my social media use is sporadic because it kind of depends on my mood. But I think I'm probably more active on Twitter, although I do have IG and Facebook, and on all of them I'm Morénike Giwa. So it's like more Nike and then Geo, like go away, but don't go away. And I have my website is the same, morenikegiwa.com. And so I do writing, consulting, and just really like, connecting with people, and just kind of really right now, actually, I would love to hear from anyone who is of interest. I'm working on an edited collection on neurodivergence in the Black community, and I'm wanting to capture a variety of voices and not just certain ones, but, holistically kind of share our stories collectively. And so, and contributors will be compensated for being involved. So there's a contact us page on my website, or you're welcome to reach me. And I just thank you again. Look for the faces and the voices of the Black community, and Black autistics. We're out there. We exist. we're there. We and we'd love to connect with you and and just kind of show you a little love.
Wonderful. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.